It all started with a story my cousin Raphael told me a few years ago. He was a serious guy, a man of few words, but that night, sitting at the kitchen table with trembling hands and eyes fixed on something only he could see, he seemed like a different person. The story he told me that night changed something in me. To this day, when I pass by a school at night, I feel an unexplainable chill. But let's get to it. Here's the story he told me. Raphael worked as a night watchman in a school located inland in the heart of the state. It was an old place, one of those buildings that seemed to have been constructed decades ago, with large exposed brick walls, tall windows, and hallways that echoed every sound. The school was isolated, surrounded by a forest that seemed to swallow the building whole during the night. During the day, the place was full of life, with children running and shouting. But at night it was as if the air itself changed. The silence was heavy, almost palpable, and the darkness seemed to move as if it were alive. At first, Raphael thought the job would be quiet. He just had to make rounds every 2 hours, check the locks, and ensure everything was fine. But from the very first week, he began to notice strange things that shouldn't have been there. The first night, he heard footsteps in the second-floor corridor. They were light, almost imperceptible, but they resonated in a way that seemed to come from all directions at once. He grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate, but there was no one, just emptiness and silence. He tried to convince himself it was just the building settling, wood creaking, wind hitting the windows, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that. The second night was worse. He was doing his usual rounds when he saw something that made him stop abruptly. At the end of the hallway, near the science classroom, there was a silhouette. It was a child, standing still, facing away. He called out, but the silhouette didn't move. As he approached, the child simply disappeared. He didn't run, didn't hide. He vanished, as if he had never been there. Raphael began to question his sanity. He tried to ignore the events, attributing them to fatigue or the loneliness of night work. But on the third night, something happened that he couldn't ignore. He was sitting in the guard's room, trying to distract himself with a book, when he heard a noise coming from the basement. It was a low sound, almost like a whisper, but constant, as if someone were repeating the same phrase over and over. He took his flashlight and descended the stairs, each step echoing like thunder in that oppressive silence. The basement was damp and cold, with concrete walls that seemed to sweat. The noise was coming from the back, near a door he had never seen before. It was a small door made of old wood with a rusty lock. The whisper was coming from there. He approached, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. When he placed his hand on the doorknob, the whisper stopped. He opened the door. Inside, there was a small room with walls covered in scribbles. They were children's drawings, but something was off. The figures were distorted, with elongated faces and open mouths frozen in silent screams. In the center of the room, there was an old chair, and sitting on it was him. It was himself, but different. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty, and his mouth moved, whispering the same words he had heard before. Raphael doesn't remember how he got out of there. He just remembers running, climbing the stairs, rushing through the hallways, until he reached the front door. After that night, Raphael was never the same. He quit his job, moved to another city, and tried to move on, but something about that school marked him in a way he couldn't explain. He confided in me that even far away, he felt as though he was being watched. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the same low, constant whisper, as if the place refused to let him go. But the story doesn't end there. A few months later, he received a call from a former colleague, a man named Marcos, who still worked as a guard at the school. Marcos's voice was trembling, almost inaudible, as if he were trying to speak without being heard by something or someone. "Rafael, you need to come back," he said, his tone more like a desperate cry for help. "Something's happening here, worse than before. I've seen things I can't explain." Rafael hesitated. He didn't want to return to that place, but there was a desperation in Marco's voice, an urgency he couldn't ignore. Finally, he agreed to come back, but only to help Marcos understand what was going on. When he arrived at the school, it was already night. The building looked darker than in his memories, as if it had absorbed all the surrounding forest's darkness. Marcos was waiting for him at the entrance, his face pale and his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," he said, holding a flashlight between trembling hands. "I didn't know who else to turn to." Rafael followed Marcos inside the school and immediately felt the same weight in the air, the same sense that something was wrong. The hallways were silent, but not in a natural way. It was as if the silence was alive, waiting, observing. "What have you seen?" Rafael asked, trying to keep his calm. Marcos hesitated, as if he didn't want to say it out loud. "Children," he finally replied. "I've seen children. They appear at night, in the hallways, in the classrooms. They don't speak, they just look, and then they disappear." Rafael felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He knew exactly what Marcos was talking about. He had seen one of those children that night in the hallway. But now, it seemed there were many more. They began their rounds together, their flashlights lighting the path ahead. The silence was oppressive, and every step echoed like thunder. Suddenly, Marcos stopped. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Rafael heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound, but constant, a whisper. He recognized it immediately. It was the same sound he had heard in the basement that night, the sound that came from himself. "It's coming from the basement," Marcos said, his voice trembling. "I've never gone down there, not after what you told me. But today, I need to know." Rafael hesitated. He didn't want to go back to the basement, but he knew he had no choice. They descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, damper, and the whisper grew louder, more insistent. When they reached the basement door, Marcos stopped. I can't," he stammered, his face pale with terror. "I can't do it." Rafael understood. He opened the door, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The room was exactly as he remembered it, the walls covered in scribbles, the chair in the center, but this time the chair was empty. The whisper was coming from somewhere behind him. He turned slowly, and what he saw froze him to the core. At the back of the room there was a mirror, and in the mirror he saw a child. It was a girl wearing a dirty white dress, her eyes dark and empty. She stood there, staring directly at him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," she murmured, her voice resonating in the room. Rafael tried to move, but his feet were rooted to the ground, as if something was holding him in place. The girl in the mirror began to approach, her smile growing more distorted, more grotesque. And then he realized she wasn't in the mirror. She was behind him. He felt a cold hand touch his shoulder, and the whisper transformed into a high-pitched, deafening scream. He closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. But when he opened them, he was alone in the room. The whisper had stopped. The mirror was empty. He ran upstairs, where Marcos was waiting, his eyes filled with terror. "What happened?" Marcos asked, his voice trembling. Rafael didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew something was wrong in that school, something that couldn't be explained, something that wouldn't let them go. And then they heard it again, a low, almost imperceptible sound, but constant a whisper. This time it was coming from everywhere. The darkness spread, and the horror had only just begun that night. Rafael and Marcos couldn't leave the school. The doors were locked, not by padlocks or bolts, but by something that seemed greater than either of them could comprehend. Every time they tried to force an exit, the hallways stretched longer, the walls shifted as if they were alive, and the whisper from the basement grew louder, more insistent, as if calling them back. "We need to figure out what's going on," Rafael said, trying to keep his calm, though his heart was pounding like a drum in his chest. "If we don't do something, we'll never get out of here." Marcos nodded, but his face was pale, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. They decided to return to the basement, because it seemed to be the center of everything. The descent down the stairs was slow, each step echoing like an omen of what was to come. The air was icy, and the dampness clung to their skin, as if the basement were absorbing them. When they entered the mirrored room, they found something that paralyzed them. The walls, once covered in distorted scribbles, were now filled with names, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, written in small, tight letters, as if someone had spent years recording them. In the center of the room, the chair was occupied. It was the girl in the white dress, but now she was different. Her eyes were completely black, and her mouth moved constantly, whispering the names on the walls. "She's calling them," Marcos murmured, his voice almost inaudible. "She's calling everyone who has ever been here." Rafael felt an intense, cold run down his spine. He approached the girl, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, she stopped whispering and looked him straight in the eyes. Her smile was now an expression of pure horror, and her voice rang clear and sharp in the room. "You shouldn't have come back, Rafael," she said. "Now you're part of this." Before he could react, the walls began to bleed, not ordinary blood, but something dark and thick, flowing over the names and erasing them one by one. The floor trembled, and the girl's chair began to sink, as if pulled by something beneath her. Rafael tried to pull back, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped, as if held by some invisible force. Marcos screamed, trying to pull him back, but it was useless. The girl began to laugh, a high-pitched, deafening sound that echoed through the school's hallways. And then Rafael saw it. He saw what lay beneath the chair. It was an abyss, a darkness so profound it seemed endless. Inside, he could see faces of children, adults, people he had never seen before. They were trapped there, trying to escape. But something kept them in place. "It's the ritual," the girl said, her voice now a mix of laughter and whispers. "The ritual of the forgotten. Everyone who comes here becomes part of it. And now it's your turn." Rafael felt an irresistible force pulling him toward the abyss. He tried to fight, tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the whisper that now came from all sides. Marcos tried to hold him back, but his hands slipped, and Rafael was dragged into the darkness. When he woke up, he was in a place he couldn't describe. It was as if he were in an infinite corridor, with walls made of shadows and a floor that seemed to shift beneath his feet. He wasn't alone. There were other people there, all with pale faces and empty eyes, as if they had been drained of everything that made them human. And at the center of the corridor stood the girl in the white dress, now taller, more distorted, as if she had grown, nourished by the terror of those trapped there. "Welcome to your new home, Rafael," she said, her voice resonating like thunder. "Here you will never be forgotten. Here you will become part of me." Rafael tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in around him, and the whisper became a scream that seemed to come from within himself. And then he understood. He would never leave. He would never be free. He was now part of the school, part of the darkness, part of the ritual. Meanwhile, Marcos, still in the basement, saw the chair return to its empty position. The walls stopped bleeding, and the whisper ceased. He was alone, but he knew he wasn't safe. He ran upstairs, trying to find an exit, but the hallways seemed endless. Then he heard a low, almost imperceptible whisper came from all sides. "Marcos." A voice murmured, soft and sweet, like a child's. "You can't escape. You already belong to us." He turned and saw the girl in the white dress now, with Rafael's face smiling at him, and then he understood he would never leave. He was now part of the school, part of the darkness, part of the ritual, and the school remained, its doors open during the day. Children laughed and played, unaware of the horror that lived within its walls. But when the sun set, the whisper returned, and the darkness always found a new victim. Thus, the ritual of the forgotten continued, fueled by the terror of those who dared to enter the school after nightfall. And you, who are reading this story, perhaps you've already heard the whisper. Perhaps you've already felt the darkness moving around you. Be careful. The school might be closer than you think. And the ritual never ends. It was my friend Lucas who told me this story. He wasn't the type to make things up, and certainly not the type to scare easily. But that night, as we sat drinking coffee in a deserted cafe, he seemed different. His eyes were deep, his hands trembling slightly, and he kept looking behind him, as if expecting someone or something to be there, watching. When he finally began to speak, his voice was a whisper, raspy and almost inaudible. It was in this village, deep in the countryside, the kind of place in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by bushes and silence. I was there for work, conducting a soil study for a mining company. The village was small, with maybe 50 houses at most, and the only school was an old, abandoned building, so everyone said. Lucas paused, looking at the cold coffee in his cup. He seemed hesitant, as if reluctant to continue, but something about this story haunted him so deeply that he couldn't keep it to himself. One night, after a long day of work, I was heading back to the guest house where I was staying. It was late, and the village was deserted. All you could hear was the wind rustling through the leaves of the trees. That's when I saw him, a tall, thin man in a black suit, standing perfectly still in front of the school. He was facing away, but I knew he wasn't from around here. Something about him was wrong. The way he stood, motionless, like a statue. and the silence around him it was different, heavier, as if the air had been sucked out. Lucas took a deep breath, gripping the cup tighter. I didn't want to approach him, but something compelled me to. It was as if I had no control over my own body. When I got closer, he turned around. His face was pale, almost cadaverous, and his eyes so dark, like bottomless pits. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, almost mechanical, as if he were trying to mimic a human expression and failing miserably. He called my name. "Lucas," he said, his voice seeming to come from all around at once. "You're late for class?" I didn't understand anything, but before I could react, he opened the door of the school and walked in. The door creaked, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to follow him, but I did. Lucas stopped again, this time looking at me with an expression of pure terror. Inside the school, it was as if time had stopped. The air was heavy, full of dust, and the walls were covered in strange scribble symbols I had never seen before. The man was there, at the end of the hallway, standing in front of a classroom. He gestured for me to enter, and I did. What I saw in that room wasn't possible. There were students sitting at desks, all facing away from me. They were motionless, like wax mannequins. The man, the teacher, climbed onto the platform and began writing something on the board. I couldn't see what it was, but I heard the screech of chalk against the surface's sound that seemed to echo in my head. Then he turned to me and said, "Today, we will learn what happens when you ignore warnings." That's when the students turned around. They had no faces, just dark holes where their faces should have been. And then they started laughing, high-pitched, shrill laugh that seemed to tear through the air. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The teacher began walking toward me, and I felt something warm trickle down my face. It was blood. I was bleeding from my eyes, nose, and mouth. He stopped in front of me, leaned down, and whispered, "Class isn't over yet." Lucas was trembling now, his hands gripping the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. I don't know how I got out of there. I just remember waking up in the guest house with sunlight on my face. At first, I thought it was a nightmare, but he pulled up his sleeve, revealing a strange mark on his wrist. It was like a burn, but in the shape of a symbol, the same symbol he had seen on the walls of the school. It appeared that night, and since then, I've been dreaming of him, the teacher. He keeps calling me back to class, and I don't know how much longer I can resist. Lucas looked at me, his eyes filled with despair. I don't want to go back, but he's going to take me. He always takes. Then he fell silent. The silence in the cafe was oppressive, and I couldn't help but glance at the door, half expecting the teacher to walk in with his twisted smile and bottomless eyes. Lucas never spoke of that night again, but sometimes when I saw him, I noticed he was paler, thinner, as if something were slowly draining him from the inside. And I couldn't help but think about that abandoned school, that dark classroom, and the teacher who had never been hired but still taught. Lucas disappeared a week after telling me this story. He stopped responding to my messages, didn't answer my calls. I went to his apartment, but the door was locked and the curtains were drawn. The landlord said he hadn't seen him in days. Something in me knew he hadn't just decided to vanish. Something or someone had taken him. It was then that I received the envelope. It was on the kitchen table when I got home from work. There was no sender, No stamp, just my name, written in thin, shaky handwriting, as if traced by a trembling hand. Inside, there was a single sheet of yellowed paper with a handwritten message. He's calling me again. Class isn't over. If you're reading this, it's because I couldn't escape. But you need to know the truth. The school's not abandoned. It never was. He's there, and he's waiting. Don't go to the village. Don't look for me. But if you do, if you go find the journal, it's hidden in the school's basement. He doesn't want anyone to read it. He doesn't want anyone to know. The message ended with a series of strange symbols, the same ones Lucas had shown me on his wrist. My hands trembled as I held the paper. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew it was true. Lucas was in danger, and somehow I had been dragged into this. The village was exactly as Lucas had described. It silhouetted, enveloped by a thick mist that seemed to suck the life out of everything around it. The houses were old, some abandoned, others with faint lights glowing behind the windows. The school stood at the Centaura two-story building with peeling walls and broken windows. Even from afar, I could feel the weight of the structure, as if it were alive, breathing, watching. I shouldn't have gone there. I knew it, but something drew me in a force I couldn't explain. As I approached the school, the air grew colder, and the silence around me became oppressive. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I hesitated, but then I heard something that made me stop. Brithina voice. It was coming from inside the school, low and distant, but clear enough for me to understand. It was Lucas. He was calling my name. Come in, he said. Class is about to start. I didn't want to enter. My entire body screamed to run, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me inside. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by a faint light coming from a room at the far end. Lucas's voice was coming from there, but now it sounded different, distorted, as if filtered through something or someone. When I entered the room, my heart stopped. It was full of students, all sitting in rows, their backs turned to me. They were motionless, exactly as Lucas had described. At the back of the room, the teacher stood with his back to us, writing something on the board. The sound of chalk scratching against the surface echoed in my mind, each screech louder than the last. I tried to move, but my legs were paralyzed. Then the teacher turned around. He had no face where there should have been eyes, a nose, and a mouth. There was just a dark void. He extended his hand toward me, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if something were trying to rip my soul out. You're late, he said, his voice resonating as if it were coming from all around at once. But don't worry, class isn't over yet. That's when the students turned around. They had no faces, either just dark holes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. They began to laugh, a high-pitched piercing sound that seemed to shred the air. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. The teacher began walking toward me, and I felt something warm trickle down my face. It was blood. You shouldn't have come, he whispered, his voice now inside my head. But now that you're here, you'll learn. You'll learn what happens to those who ignore the warnings. I don't know how I managed to get out of there. I just remember running blindly, tripping over broken furniture and peeling walls. When I finally burst out of the school, the sun was setting and the village was deserted. I ran to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the key. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that froze me in place. The teacher was there, standing in the middle of the road, watching. He didn't try to follow me. He just stood there, immobile, with that twisted smile and his bottomless eyes. And then he raised his hand, as if beckoning. "Next class," he said, his voice echoing in my mind, even though I was already far away. Now I'm at home, locked in my room. The lights are on, but the darkness seems to move, as if it were alive. I can't stop thinking about that school, that classroom, and the teacher who was never hired but still teaches. And I know he'll call me again. He always calls. But before that happens, I need to find the journal. I need to uncover the truth, because if I don't, the next class might be the last. I don't know how much time I have before he calls me again. The nights are longer, and the silence around me seems charged with murmurs I can't understand. Sometimes I see shadows in the corners of my room, shapes that move too fast to be human. And in the darkest hours, when sleep finally catches up with me, I hear the sound of chalk scratching against the board, echoing like a distant call. He's waiting. He's always waiting. And deep down, I know there's no escape. Next class is scheduled, and the teacher never misses. It was a cold autumn night when my uncle, a reserved and taciturn man, decided to tell me a story he swore he would never repeat. He was sitting in his worn-out armchair, his face illuminated only by the flickering glow of a candle. The wind howled outside, battering the windows as if it wanted to get in. He looked at me with dark eyes and began to speak, his voice heavy with a weight I had never heard before. It all happened in a remote village deep in the countryside, he began. A place so small it didn't even appear on maps. There was an old, abandoned school there, unused for decades. They said something terrible had happened within those walls, something so horrifying that no one dared to speak of it. But as it often happens, the young people of the village liked to challenge their fears. That's how a group of students decided to spend the night in the school as a sort of courage test. He paused, as if reliving every detail in his mind. I leaned forward, completely absorbed by his words. There were 5 students, 3 boys and 2 girls. They entered the school at dusk, armed with flashlights and sleeping bags. The atmosphere was already oppressive from the start. The air inside the school was cold and damp, and the silence was so dense it felt suffocating. The walls were cracked, and the floor creaked with every step. But the worst of all was the smell of sickly sweet, rotting odor, like decaying flesh. That seemed to emanate from every corner at once. My uncle closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to shake off the memory of that smell. They decided to gather in the classroom on the top floor, where, according to legend, a teacher had committed a massacre before disappearing. As they climbed the stairs, one of the boys, Lucas, started laughing nervously. He said he heard footsteps behind them, but when they turned around, there was no one. His laughter echoed through the empty hallways, and then it suddenly stopped. Everyone looked at him, and he was pale, as if he had seen something he couldn't explain. He paused again, and I noticed my hands were sweating. When they arrived in the classroom, they decided to begin the challenge. The rule was simple. Each of them had to stand alone in a corner of the room, facing away from the center, and count to 100. No one could turn around, no matter what happened. It seemed easy, but something wasn't right. As soon as they started, the air grew colder and the smell worsened. Then they began to hear things, whispers, muffled laughter, approaching footsteps. One of the boys, Pedro, shouted that someone had touched his shoulder. When he turned, there was no one, but he swore he had felt icy fingers on his skin. My uncle looked at me, and I saw a glimmer of terror in his eyes. That's when things started to go really wrong. One of the girls, Anna, began to cry. She said she heard a voice calling her Nima voice that seemed to come from inside the wall itself. She tried to keep counting, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, and then she screamed. When the others turned around, she was different. Her eyes were completely black, and she was smiling in a way that wasn't human. Before anyone could react, she ran to the window and jumped. They heard the sound of her body hitting the ground below. But when they looked out, there was nothing. No body, no blood, just silence. I felt a chill run down my spine. My uncle continued, his voice now almost a whisper. The others tried to leave the room, but the door was locked. The flashlights began to flicker, and in the dark, they heard laughter and crying. One of the boys, Lucas, started screaming that something was pulling at his feet. He disappeared into the darkness, and when the lights came back on, he was gone. The two remaining, a girl named Marina and Pedro, tried to stay together. But then Pedro started saying things that made no sense. He kept saying the teacher was there, that he wanted him to finish the exam, and then he just collapsed. Marina was the only one who survived until dawn. When the door finally opened, she was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth, repeating the same phrase over and over. No one finishes the exam. My uncle stopped talking and looked at me, his eyes full of deep sorrow. Marina was never the same after that. She was taken to a psychiatric hospital, where she spent the rest of her days in a catatonic state, and the school, well, it's still there, abandoned and silent, waiting for the next group of brave souls eager to attempt the exam. But one thing is certain, no one survives to finish it. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted, as if he had carried this secret for a long time. I didn't know what to say. The story was so vivid, so real, that I could almost smell the sickly sweet, rotting odor of the school. Hear the whispers in the dark hallways, and then my uncle looked at me again, and this time there was something in his eyes that frightened me even more. I never told you this before, he said, but Marina was my sister. At that moment, the wind outside stopped, and the silence became the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. My uncle didn't stop talking after that shocking revelation. He seemed relieved to have finally shared the secret, but also deeply disturbed. As if recounting the story had reopened a wound that had never healed, he leaned forward, holding the candle with trembling hands, and continued, his voice now deeper, more urgent. Marina never spoke about what happened that night, he said, but there was something she always carried with her Ivan in the hospital, an old yellowed notebook that she clutched to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. The doctors tried to take it away several times, but she panicked, screaming until she lost her voice, so they left it alone. When she died, years later, the notebook ended up in my hands. He paused, as if struggling against his own will to continue. I could barely breathe, hanging on his every word. I didn't want to look inside, he admitted. I was afraid of what I might find. But one night, when the darkness seemed thicker than usual, I finally opened the notebook. The pages were filled with scribbles, disconnected words, and drawings that made no sense. but one thing repeated over and over, a phrase written hundreds of times in increasingly distorted letters. "He's still here." My uncle looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made me shrink back in my chair. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was he? The teacher? Something worse? I decided I had to find out, he said. So one night, I returned to the village. The school was still there, exactly as Marina had described it. It was as if time hadn't touched it. The walls were covered in moss, and the broken windows looked like empty eyes staring out at everything. The smell, that same sickly sweet, rotting odor, was still there, stronger than ever. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to shake off the memory. I went inside. Every step echoed in the empty hallways, and I felt like I was being watched. When I reached the classroom on the top floor, the air was so cold I could see my breath. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, there was a table, and on it, a notebook, identical to Marina's. It was open, and the pages were turning by themselves, as if an invisible hand were flipping through them. I approached, even though I knew I shouldn't, and looked at what was written. It was the same phrase, "He's still here." But this time, there was something more, a name, "Find me." He stopped again, and I realized my hands were trembling. I don't know why I did what I did, but I picked up the notebook. The moment I touched it, I heard a low laugh coming from all around me at once. Then the lights from my flashlight began to flicker. In the darkness, I saw something move. It was a tall, thin figure with eyes that glowed like embers. It stood in the corner of the room, watching me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It approached, and I could smell the scent of something burned like charred flesh. It murmured something, a word I couldn't understand. Then it disappeared. My uncle took a deep breath, as if struggling to keep his composure. I managed to get out of there, but not without taking something with me. Since that night, I've had dreams where I'm back in that room, and he's there, waiting. And he always says the same thing: "You haven't finished the test." Then I wake up, and the sickly sweet, rotting smell is in my room, even though no one else can smell it. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. "I told you this because you need to know," he said. "Because I think he won't let me go anytime soon. And because I think he's starting to follow you, too." Before I could respond, the candle went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, I swear I heard a low laugh coming from somewhere very, very close. My uncle never spoke of that night again, but I never needed to ask. In the months that followed, strange things began to happen to me. The sickly sweet, rotting smell would appear out of nowhere, even in places where there was no reason for it to exist. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced there was someone in the corner of my room, watching me in silence. And the dreams were always the same classroom, the same tall, thin figure with glowing, ember-like eyes, murmuring that word I could never understand. One night, I decided I had to confront my fears. I took the notebook my uncle had left me before he disappeared. Yes, he vanished without a trace, as if he had never existed, and I returned to the village. The school was still there, but it now seemed different. The walls were more dilapidated, as if time had accelerated, and the smell was unbearable. When I entered, it felt like the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting for me. I climbed the stairs to the classroom, on the top floor. The notebook in my hands seemed to grow heavier with every step. When I entered the room, the table was still there, and on it, another notebook, open to the same page. He's still here. But this time, a new phrase was written underneath. Welcome back. Before I could react, the lights went out, and I heard the laugh. It was low, guttural, and coming from all directions at once. When the lights came back on, he was there, in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on me. This time, he didn't disappear. He approached, and I could see his face clearly. It was the teacher, or at least what was left of him. His skin was burned and twisted, and his lips moved to form a single word. I had no choice. I sat at the table, the notebook open in front of me, and began to write. The words flowed by themselves, as if something were guiding my hand. And then I understood. The test was never over. It would never end, because he would always need more students. Now, as I write these words, I feel him here, in a corner of my room, watching me. The sickly sweet, rotting smell fills the air, and I know there's no escape. The test continues. And if you're reading this, know that he's already behind you, too. Because no one finishes the test. My Uncle Carlos told me what happened. In the village where he grew up, my uncle wasn't the type to make up stories or give in to superstitions. He was skeptical, just like me. That's why, when he began to speak, his voice trembling and his eyes wide, I felt a chill run down my spine. He made me promise never to repeat this story to anyone. But I can't carry it anymore. It's too heavy. See you tomorrow.